Hello and welcome to this webinar, Community Eligibility Provision, Overcoming the Loss of School Meal Application Data, hosted by the Food Research and Action Center, or FRAC. I'm Steve Hayward, FRAC's Senior Communications Coordinator. Before we begin, I'd like to cover some housekeeping items. We expect this webinar to run about 60 minutes. We are recording the session and will send the recording and slides in a follow-up email, so you will still receive all the information even if you have to hop off. After the panelists have made their remarks, there will be time for questions and answers. To ask a question, please use the Q&A function under the More Panels button on the bottom right of the WebEx dashboard. With that, I'll pass it off to Crystal Fitzsimons, Director of School and Out-of-School Time Programs at FRAC. Take it away, Crystal.
Thanks, Steve. And we're really excited to have everyone here with us this afternoon to talk about community eligibility. This is the second in our community eligibility provision series that we're doing this spring. And we're going to be digging into what happens when school districts no longer have free and reduced price school meal application data. Next slide. I want to thank our webinar co-hosts. You can see the list. It's a pretty broad list of a lot of our education partners that we work very closely with on community eligibility and other provisions, and we're thrilled that they're co-hosting this webinar this afternoon with us. Next slide. Okay, so part of the reason why we're doing a whole series on community eligibility, FRAC is always focused on increasing the number of schools that are doing community eligibility. But it is even more important this year as we look ahead to the potential loss of the seamless summer option waiver. Schools across the country have been able to offer free meals to all students using the seamless summer option waiver. It has not, the waiver authority that USDA has not been extended by Congress. And so as we look ahead to the 2022-2023 school year, we are really encouraging schools to think about community eligibility as an option if they're eligible. Community eligibility was created in 2010 through the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act, and it was implemented nationwide in 2014-2015 school year. So we've been doing a lot of work at FRAC and with a lot of our partners to overcome some of the challenges or barriers to community eligibility. And now that we've been operating it for so many years, there's lots of strategies and lots of ways to implement it and get over barriers that people both perceive and have with community eligibility. And at this point, we have over 30,000 schools operating under community eligibility. Which actually translates into about 1 in 3 schools who are participating in the school breakfast and school lunch program. So there are plenty of schools, plenty of best practices, and plenty of ways to get around any real or perceived barriers to community eligibility. We're not going to be digging into the basics of community eligibility today. A couple weeks ago, we actually did our CEP kickoff webinar, and you can go ahead and listen to that, and that can provide basics on community eligibility for you. But today, we're really going to kind of dig into the piece around school meal applications, because as most of you know, one of the things that community eligibility does is it bases the measure of poverty within the school on identified students. And these are students who are automatically certified for free school meals outside of the application process. So those are kids who participate, whose households participate in SNAP or TANF or the food distribution program for Indian reservations, or who are homeless or migrant or in foster care or in Head Start. And so they're automatically eligible for free school meals. They can be certified without an application. A couple of states are able to use Medicaid Direct Cert as well. But it gets rid of the school meal application process. And to account for that, the percentage of identified students is multiplied by 1.6, and that is the claiming percentage, the number of free meals. So like if 50% of the students are identified students, you multiply that by 1.6, 80% of your meals are reimbursed at the free rate, 20 at the paid, and the 1.6 is to account for the additional kids who would come in outside of the school meal application, within the school meal application process. So we're going to talk a little bit today about what it means since school meal applications aren't being collected and how to deal with that since additional students are not being certified. Next slide. And today I'm really excited about the speakers that we have to kind of talk through some of these issues. Todd and Fatimah are with the U.S. Department of Education, and I have been working with Todd really since community eligibility went nationwide, and he's done a lot of amazing work thinking through, how to make sure community eligibility works with Title I funding, because he really does lead that effort. And then we also have Kristin Blagg with the Urban Institute, who's been doing a lot of work looking at free and reduced price eligibility data and what that means, and she's going to be sharing some of her information and lessons learned. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to Todd and Fatimah.
Thank you, Crystal. So over the next few minutes, we'll discuss how the Department of Education's Title I Part A program, or Title I for short, intersects with the National School Lunch Program, and especially for the purpose of today, how these programs relate to the CEP component of the meals program that Crystal just discussed. As a general overview, Title I's purpose is to provide all children significant opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and high-quality education, and to close educational achievement gaps. To help achieve these purposes, there are some instances in which a state or local educational agency, or LEA for short, needs student-level poverty data. Often data from the National School Lunch Program, or NSLP, are the most readily available poverty data source, or the only poverty data source available to a state or LEA. There are a number of ways in which Title I therefore intersects with the school lunch program and therefore with CEP. However, this should not be a barrier for participating in CEP. From our perspective, Title I can operate just as well in LEAs with CEP schools as it does in LEAs without. So in other words, an LEA does not have to choose between participation in CEP and operating a successful Title I program. Both can be done. Next slide, please. So we are going to go over 4 connections today that you all might see on the screen. We have within district allocations, we have within state allocations, equitable services to eligible private school students, and accountability. So this slide will outline the areas in which Title I and CEP intersect in the realm of those 4 areas. So when determining within district allocations, a primary intersection is that most LEAs use NSLP data to determine which of their schools are eligible for Title I funds and how much eligible schools receive. So this process, called informally Title I ranking and serving, requires school-level poverty data. For this, an LEA would need to know the poverty percentage in each school, which then helps inform the LEA of which schools are eligible and how much an eligible school receives. Choices of school poverty measures include school lunch data as an option. An LEA may use school lunch data, and like Crystal said earlier, TANF, Medicaid, census, or a combination of sources to determine school eligibility and allocations. CEP data are part of school lunch data. There is ED's Title I CEP guidance on within district allocations, which applies when the school district has a CEP school and uses school lunch data to rank and serve schools. The other 3 intersections that may occur between Title I and CEP are the within state Title I allocations to LEAs. In some instances, the implementation by an LEA of providing Title I services to eligible private school students, and the use of CEP data to identify children in the economically disadvantaged subgroup for Title I accountability purposes. I will go ahead and pass it over to my colleague Todd, and he'll go ahead and cover resources from the U.S. Department of Education that support the implementation of Title I when state or LEA also uses CEP data. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatimah. Next slide, please. Thank you. As Fatimah mentioned, there are several areas where we've got the intersection between the data from the National School Lunch Program, including the direct certification data that's such a big part of CEP. And so wanted to just make sure that folks here have access and are aware of documents that are the department's provided to help support, as Fatimah said, implementing the Title I program to help improve the achievement of low achieving students, and not letting that be a barrier to electing to participate in CEP. So the first document on the website was released just a couple months ago, is about within district allocations to schools. So this is just what Fatimah was talking about a minute or two ago, where a district gets Title I funds and ranks its schools by poverty to determine which ones are eligible to get Title I funds and then how much the eligible schools get. The document includes an entire section on CEP, the use of CEP data in the within district allocation process. It also pulls together information that previously had been in multiple documents, including the 2015 Title I CEP guidance that's also listed at the end of the slide. It describes the requirements and options that the district has in distributing Title I funds to schools, and this includes the option which many districts, as Fatimah said, use CEP or other national school lunch data as the measure of poverty to rank schools by poverty, but it also describes the other allowable measures that a district may use to rank its schools, which do not involve using national school lunch data. Schools can be ranked by Medicaid data or TANF data or a combination of sources. So that's a recent document, pulls a lot of information that was previously available but in multiple documents into one place for users. The second document was released in January 2022, and it's an update. It's a fact sheet that was updated to an update to one that was released in January 2021 that provides information that apply to states and school districts that use National School Lunch Program data to implement Title I, several other programs in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act during this school year and next school year as a result of possibly having incomplete national school lunch data due to the nationwide USDA waivers that are in effect through June of 2022. So even though, as Crystal mentioned earlier, those waivers are ending at the end of June, a lot of times for Title I and other ESDA programs, data from one school year gets used in the following school year. For example, for the within district allocations we were talking about a moment ago. So that fact sheet provides options for states and districts to consider as they might not have the typical school lunch data that they would have had from this school year and last year because of those waivers and without the collection of the applications. The third document it's primarily is about the Title I services to eligible private school children and includes information on the use, in some instances, of National School Lunch Program data to determine that a district might use to determine the number of private school children from low-income families, which in turn is the basis for how much of a district's Title I funds it has to use to provide services to eligible private school children. Then the final document is older, but still includes relevant information around Title I and CEP, particularly for any information on how that intersects with within state Title I allocations on a bit of a limited basis, and for accountability in terms of using school lunch data to identify children in the economically disadvantaged subgroup. So really, thank you for the chance to come and join you all today, and just and for the opportunity to note these resources, which we hope are helpful. And I think that will do it for our overview, and we'll turn it over to the next person. Thank you, Ms. Blagg. Thanks.
Thank you. Can I go ahead? Hi, everyone. My name is Kristin Blagg. I'm a Senior Research Associate in the Education Data and Policy Center at the Urban Institute. And I'm going to offer sort of a researcher framework of the way that I think about CEP and the way that CEP impacts, in this case, particularly state allocations of funding for low-income students. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to stress, so we're a nonprofit social economic policy research organization. I may express views and positions in this paper, in this talk, but the Urban Institute doesn't take views, and the views should not be construed as the Urban Institute's views. If we go to the next slide, the 2 points I have today is that recent changes have really improved and increased access to school meals even before the pandemic. But yes, we do face the reduced utility of the free lunch receipt measure as a poverty measure. But we have been tracking lots of action by states, particularly in the wake of the universal meals during the pandemic, for new opportunities for identifying low-income students. And I'm going to sort of discuss some of those options today as potential avenues for other states to explore. Next slide. So just setting that framing that students benefit from universal free lunch. I'll go to the next slide. And just talk about CEP as an option that has been around for more than a decade at this point. We've already covered how schools and districts can elect to use CEP to provide free lunch. But also I want to acknowledge, like, I feel like the conversations around universal school meals have really increased due to the pandemic and the SSO waivers. And I think the time is right for a lot of policymakers are thinking about these issues. Next slide. So from the research perspective, we have already gotten a lot of great research evidence around the value of universal school meals in terms of increasing test performance, reducing school suspension rates, and even increasing student health. So for example, the share of students with a healthy BMI. And I think framing out those values that seem intuitive to us, but are also, borne out in the research evidence is very important. Next slide. And then I just want to talk a little bit about the degree to which we see that the shift to universal free lunch can really create sort of less reliable indicators of low income status. Next slide. So for example, this yellow line here this is an older data set, but it sort of shows the share of students that come from households that meet the free or reduced price criteria sort of in survey data. And then if we click, we'll see the share that are identified by schools as eligible. We see it pretty closely tracks in the pre-CEP years. So we know there were other provisions that schools can use during this time. And if we go into the CEP years by clicking again, we can see that we do start to see that is divorced, right? So we're giving more students free meals, and we're also therefore identifying more students as low income. And it creates just a little bit more uncertainty in how we're going to allocate other types of resources for students. If we go to the next slide. And as a result, states are quickly recalibrating which data they collect and report. So some states have just moved to reporting direct certification. Some just report still the free and reduced price lunch numbers, and others are reporting a combination. Next slide. And what we do know is that when states transition from reporting their free and reduced price lunch numbers to direct certification, for many reasons, direct certification doesn't fully capture students. So we tend to identify fewer students in that direct certification than in the free lunch sort of overall. Next slide. So there are lots of different options for identifying low-income students for funding and accountability. And I want to sort of just briefly talk about a recent experience where we're working with the Colorado State Legislature to help them think through a new option that would remove them from the free and reduced price lunch measure, which they've been using to allocate at-risk funding. Colorado had been using the share of students identified as for free or reduced meals, but districts and schools that had adopted CEP were reporting that they felt like they weren't fully representing the poverty of their students, because students and families had less incentive to return forms because they were already receiving the meals without them. And so broadly, there's just concern that we weren't fully capturing need in the funding formula. So we go to the next slide. I'll just talk about some of the at-risk measures that we looked at. So one that is often sort of brought up is direct certification, and either direct certification alone, sort of that direct link to SNAP, maybe TANF or FDIPR, but also the sort of USDA pilot project to connect to Medicaid data as well. We also, when we were thinking about this, explored other options, such as using a school neighborhood poverty measure, one of which is published by Department of Ed, census poverty estimates, maybe household tax data, neighborhood SES estimates. So that would involve locating each student within their own neighborhood and using data like the share of adults in that neighborhood that have a bachelor's degree. And then we also explored sort of keeping those alternate income forms, but we heard from stakeholders that does keep or even increase the administrative burden that CEP is intended to solve. And then the last slide that I'll just show today, and then we'll kind of go, I see questions popping up, is talking about the way that Colorado eventually, is working towards, which is this idea of using direct certification, probably with that addition of that Medicaid, which tends to increase the number of students that are identified administratively, and also supplementing that data with the neighborhood SES. We know not every student is able to fully take up the programs that their family might be otherwise income eligible for, and we think the neighborhood SES estimates really help sort of capture those students, particularly students that might be living in low SES areas, but maybe not using those programs directly. And I think I have some other slides where I can talk more about our experience in Colorado if needed, but I think I'll turn it back to Crystal at this point.
Thanks, Kristen. So I guess we can jump ahead a couple of slides. Okay, and I just wanted to talk about a couple of things before we open it up for questions. I know that Title I is not something that everybody on the call is as familiar with, so we definitely are looking forward to lots of questions in the chat and the Q&A and digging into them. Title I is the funding source that I hear the most about, the most questions about, but I did want to also just kind of elevate that there has been a lot of other work that's been done to kind of address other funding questions because community eligibility has been rolled out for so long. So for those of you who are familiar with the child nutrition programs, for summer food, for at-risk after-school snacks and suppers, and for childcare homes, that all has a basis. Eligibility can be based upon the percentage of free and reduced price eligible students in the school. And so since community eligibility kind of changes that measure, what USDA did was they issued guidance that allows community eligibility schools to use their identified student percentage and multiply that by 1.6. And that determines if they hit 50% or higher, then they're eligible for summer food and at-risk after-school meal programs, and for childcare homes in the community. So they've thought about that, and if a school is grouped with other schools, it's the individual schools' data that they use. So just wanted to flag that. And then there's benefits to kids if your school decides to take up community eligibility. During the pandemic, they created the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program. If you attend a community eligibility school, the family is eligible to participate. The program name was changed to Affordable Connectivity Program, but you can also go to FRAC's community eligibility database to figure out if you're eligible, if your school participates. And then the other thing I wanted to flag is Pandemic EBT. This was a program that was created during the pandemic, and if a child attends a school that participates in community eligibility, then the child is eligible for pandemic EBT. And so like this summer, schools that were participating in community eligibility during the school year, their students would all be eligible for summer benefits this summer if the state's providing them. And we expect that program to continue into the next school year and next summer. So that is a benefit that community eligibility would also bring. There's been guidance put out on SAT, ACT, and AP fees, which are kids who are certified for free or reduced price meals are able to have those fees waived. Guidance has been put out. They still do need to be individually determined eligible, but you can use direct certification to do that. And so it does make it a little bit easier. Next slide. And so the implications for eliminating school meal applications, we have that up on our website and you can dig into it a little bit more and take a look. There's the link right there. We are going to be issuing our upcoming CEP report, which is going to give information on eligible and participating schools that you can take a look at. And every year, my colleague Allison Perez is putting together kind of this database of eligible schools and participating schools, and you can use that to see, you know, what your schools, if your schools in your area are participating, what their identified student percentages, what their claiming percentages is. But it's a nice way to kind of dig into what's happening at your community. We also have a piece on making community eligibility work at low ISPs and some strategies for improving direct certification, which I think are incredibly helpful as we look ahead to implementing community eligibility for the next school year. Next slide. And I just want to briefly mention our CEP grouping tool and our financial calculators, which you can go to, and it makes it a lot easier for you to group schools together to get a higher ISP. And then kind of the financial calculator will walk you through like the financial questions and, you know, some of the key things to consider when you're implementing community eligibility is kind of maximizing the federal funding for child nutrition. So using after-school suppers, increasing school breakfast participation, and increasing overall participation in school meals can really help with implementing community eligibility at a lower level. And I do see a couple questions that I'll just address really quickly. Someone wanted to know why the 1.6 multiplier, and I will say that you know was in the 2010 Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act. It is based on some analysis that for every 10 kids who are certified through direct certification, an additional 6 children would be certified through the application process. That's why there's the 1.6 to account for the additional children. And we and others have actually been asking for the multiplier to be increased to actually 2.5. And there was a proposal that passed out of the House in the Build Back Better Act, which would have increased it to 2.5. And that would have allowed all eligible community eligibility schools at this point, which are 40%, to get 100% of their reimbursement, because we know that the 1.6 can be a barrier for some schools at the lower eligibility level. So if you're interested in that, I would encourage people to call your congressmen and senators and tell them you want community eligibility expanded and the multiplier to change to 2.5. We have resources on our website to help people do that, but Congress really would need to make that change. Next slide. So before we move on to Q&A, I just wanted to mention and encourage people to join our next community eligibility webinars. As I mentioned, we're doing a series this year. The next one is on May 5th, and it's really going to kind of dig into making CEP work with low ISPs and partial district implementation. And then May 19th, for those of you who are in states, I think Kristin did a great job of talking about some of the different thinking around state education funding. But for those of you who are in a state where your state requires an alternative form in order to give out state education funding, we'll be doing a webinar on May 19th on that, and there'll be a few more coming in. So with that, I think the next slide is actually opening it up for Q&A. And I know I've seen a couple of things come through in the chat. So I can go ahead and pose these to our panelists. And Josh, FRAC does work with school districts to help figure out and implement community eligibility. You can definitely reach out to me or to others on my team, Alexis Bylander or Allison Perez, who are happy to help as well. So I think the question about CEP numbers will be published, like free and reduced price numbers have been published in the past. I think that's a really good question, and it's something we should be thinking about to try and help qualify schools. And then there's a question, families get a variable amount of money on their PEBT cards depending on income. If it is a CEP school and all families. So this is actually not quite right. The pandemic EBT cards, the reason why people got varying degrees or varying amounts of money last school year is because the benefits are provided based on the number of school days they did not attend. Oh, Steve, is anybody else hearing that backdrop? It's a gone now. Okay. It's the difference in amount is actually based on the number of school days that kids were not there. It is not based on the individual family's income. Like families are either eligible for pandemic EBT or not eligible for pandemic EBT. But the amount of funding or amount of nutrition resources that a family would receive is based on the number of days that they were not in school, if that makes sense. And as far as the community eligibility application deadlines, that is up to states. So states can definitely apply for a state waiver to extend community eligibility deadlines. And then yes, CEP students would get pandemic EBT when it operates. But there's a couple more questions that I wanted to pose to the panelists because these are things that I hear from people all the time. One thing that people often ask, and I think this is a question for Todd and Fatimah, but can a district actually lose Title I money if they switch over to community eligibility?
So the question was about, would a district lose funds by switching to Title I funds, by switching to CEP? Generally, with a couple of exceptions, the use of school lunch program data really doesn't, for most districts around the country, affect how much Title I funds the school district receives because it's the Title I statute, Elementary and Secondary Education Act, requires school districts' allocations to be based primarily on census poverty estimates, or for districts like charter school districts where there are not census poverty estimates available based on the state deriving the equivalent of those data. So so for the most part, it's just the school lunch data, including CEP data, get used very often by a district for distributing Title I funds within the district, but aren't a basis for how much a district receives in general. The primary exception to that would be there's a handful of states that take advantage of the option to use different poverty data to redistribute Title I funds among their LEAs that are below 20,000 total population. So those are school districts that have a low population, and there's a handful of states that do use school lunch data as a measure to redistribute those funds. So if a district makes changes to its school lunch program, it could result in it getting more funds relative to other small LEAs within its state, or less, or not much change. I think most likely, given that the multiplier adjusts for the lack of the household applications, or is intended to, it may not have much effect at all. So, and I would say too that there's other factors in the Title I formula. So again, I think the main point is that we've tried to emphasize since CEP started is that it and Title I can work well together, and there could be any number of reasons year to year why a district's Title I allocation increases or decreases, regardless of what the district does with CEP. Thank you.
Yeah, and I have a question for Kristin. I know you did a lot of work on poverty measures for Colorado because they were rethinking their reliance on free and reduced price meals. I don't know if you can give us a little bit of the history of why they decided to dig into that.
Sure. So I think, broadly, so this is in relation to the way that Colorado was allocating funding for what they call at-risk students through their state formula to districts. And one of the things that they had heard was that using the free and reduced price lunch measure for CEP schools wasn't fully capturing need in those schools. And they wanted to explore an option that would allow more school districts to use universal school lunch programs, whether in the pandemic or after it, and might also capture a better sort of measure of need. Need is not just income year to year, but maybe also other socioeconomic factors. And so for all of those reasons, Colorado sought advice on how to think about this measure. And the priority from our perspective was not adding additional burden on schools, so not asking for more information or for additional forms to be passed out to students, but rather how could we use the existing data that we have to help sort of design a better at-risk measure. And so the measure that we settled on does focus on the direct certification link, and we do recommend also the adoption of Medicaid as an additional administrative link to improve the identification of low-income students through direct certification, and also supplemented by, nearly every school has an address for their student, using census data around the sort of socioeconomic circumstances that student lives in to help supplement the identification of students who are at risk.
Okay, well, that's really helpful. And then I know, Todd, you mentioned some of the different ways that you could actually do the Title I measure when you switched over to community eligibility, but is there any way you could rattle off all the different ways you could actually do it?
Yeah. Chris, I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last part. Apologies.
Oh, no problem. So you had mentioned that there are different ways that you can go ahead, and I know you mentioned Medicaid data and TANF, but I was wondering, is there any way you could mention every single different way that you could do the Title I?
And so for within district allocations, which we hear a fair amount is a main consideration in terms of when a district is thinking about changing the CEP or doing something different with its school lunch programs. There's a question about, well, how will that affect which schools within the district are eligible, how much they can, then how much they can receive. And so the Elementary and Secondary Education Act for the distribution of Title I funds within a district gives the district choice to use school lunch data, Medicaid data, TANF data, census data, if to the extent that they're available, or a combination of those sources, which in some cases could be if a district has switched to CEP, but doesn't think for its schools that for the purposes of Title I, that the multiplier adjusting the direct certification counts by 1.6 for Title I purposes captures all the kids that were in a school that were previously identified through household applications. If they're doing it for Title I purposes, the district could still get survey data from families if it wants to replicate the data for that school. Obviously, just weighing out whether what kind of response it'll get and whether that would be counterproductive, and that one of the advantages of CEP is removing that burden. So again, the survey would be a district survey. It would not be connected to the school meals program. But again, there's also just, while it may not get used that much, the option for distributing Title I funds within the district to just not use school lunch data at all and to use Medicaid or use TANF or a combination. So we just want to make sure that the awareness is out there of the flexibilities that Congress has given given districts. And then should also say, and don't know how common this is, but the other thing is for districts that have less than 1,000 students, they don't have to rank and serve schools at all. They can, they might have just one or two schools, but or several. They can decide, whatever measure they want to use, whatever method. It could be school need, that type of thing. They don't need poverty data at all to do rank and serve if they have less than 1,000 students. So those are some of the flexibilities for within district allocations. With other areas in which states, particularly sometimes will use school lunch data, is identifying which students are in the economically disadvantaged subgroup. The ESEA really gives a state complete flexibility for accountability purposes, which students are in that group. So there's no requirements of the state use school lunch data. It could use state measure of poverty, like what was discussed in a minute ago with Colorado as an example, or some other measure. So there's, while the school lunch data get used a lot to implement parts of say Title I, for example, there's certainly other options available, data options available as well.
And so what would your advice be if a school nutrition director said, I really want to implement community eligibility next year, and their school business officer said, well, I'm really concerned about what's going to happen with our Title I funding? What would your advice be to the school nutrition director and how they would respond to that?
Yeah, and I think that's an opportunity to refer to the resources that we've highlighted today to find information that's particular to the specific concern, and then, which I think that this happens fairly often, the school district person who's administering the Title I or other ESA program to potentially consider talking with the folks at their state educational agency, with the Title I grantee for the state, to really explore whether the potential change to CEP would have any effect. So just so that everyone at the district who's involved with the decision has access to the information to be able to make a decision that is best for the best for the district.
Great. Great, wonderful. Well, are there any other questions? I would love to make sure that people get an opportunity to ask any other questions that they have. So I think we've covered just about everything that's been put in the chat. So I'm just going to go ahead, and I actually really want to thank our speakers today. It was really great to have you on today. Like I said, questions about what happens to school meal, to the data when you move to community eligibility seems to be a big question for school districts and can sometimes deter them from community eligibility. So I hope everybody, heard today that it shouldn't, that people should be able to move forward, that there is guidance, and then there's been a lot of work done by the U.S. Department of Education and U.S. Department of Agriculture to try and overcome that for federal education funding. And Kristin talked a little bit about what's going on in the different states. We're going to dig in a little bit more for the specific states who are going to have to collect alternative forms for state education funding. But at the federal level, there's been a lot of work to overcome those barriers. So I thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you so much, Kristin, Todd, and Fatimah. We really appreciate having you on this. And if you do have any additional questions or need any additional information, don't hesitate to reach out and we'll do our best to help. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Oh, I can't hear you, Todd.